On the one hand, if you try and picture it in your mind's eye, it's a pretty spectacular and thrilling battle scene. Israel mounts a pretty gutsy uphill attack on a Canaanite fortress. They trick the Canaanites into coming out from behind their defences and pursuing them back down the valley, leaving the town defenceless. But a part of the Israelite army that Joshua had sneakily moved past the city overnight mounts an ambush from behind. It takes the fortress, sets it on fire, and then attacks the town's warriors from behind. Caught between the two halves of the Israelite army, Ai's forces are utterly decimated. The fortress is not only captured but completely destroyed. It's a brilliant piece of military strategy, and it would make a pretty epic battle scene for a movie. I was kind of thinking Lord of the Rings, but George's decision to pronounce it as AI makes me think I should be thinking more like Matrix or Techno or something. But on the other hand, when you remember that this isn't something from a movie or a book, but it claims to describe actual historical events, and it's deeply disturbing, isn't it? Because the Israelites aren't the brave defenders of their homeland in this story. They're not practicing guerrilla warfare against a terrible invading force. They are the invaders. They're attacking the fortress of Ai, slaughtering all its inhabitants in the homes, plundering the possessions, razing the fortress to the ground so it's utterly inhabitable, and then desecrating the corpse of the warlord who led it. How are we supposed to make sense of God commanding that? Why did it get included in our Bible? How can this still be God's word to us? And how on earth are we supposed to apply it to our lives? The story of the destruction of Ai is not a simple or an easy story, and I'm not here to give you simple or easy answers to any of those tough questions that I just asked. We're supposed to find stories like this unsettling, and we're supposed to wrestle with them like Jacob wrestled with God. And if you remember that story from Genesis, Jacob wrestled all night and he lost. But when he reflected on the experience afterwards, he realised he'd encountered God face to face. And I want to invite you to join me in wrestling with this story this morning and asking God that somehow, strangely, we would encounter him in the wrestling. So I'm going to ask you to pray with me, and then we're going to dive into the passage. God, understanding you and following you isn't always easy. Sometimes it does feel like a wrestling match. But we believe by faith that this is your word to us, no matter how hard it is to grasp or pin down. And we want to ask that you would help us encounter you in your word, that we would be like our spiritual ancestor Jacob, who saw you face to face, even as he wrestled with you. Open our minds and our hearts to see you clearly, God, and to worship you. Amen. Well, before we dive into the passage, I want to give you a quick explanation about the pieces of paper you found on your chair when you got down to here today. They are not to score the sermon, although you can do that if you want, and give the papers to the elders. But there should be a white piece of paper, a red piece of paper, and a pen, and if you haven't got one, Pete's got one for you. The reason I've given this to you is this is a pretty heavy story. It's a story about wrongdoing and failure, and about the consequences and the judgment that results from that, whether it's our own or other people's. And that's pretty intense, and it can get pretty heavy. And so I've given you these pieces of paper to give you something to do with that. As we're working through this passage, if what starts coming to mind and just going over and over in your head is your own wrongdoing or failure, where you've let someone else down or hurt or harm them in some way, then rather than dwelling on that, I want you to jot it down on the white piece of paper. And if as we're working through this passage, what comes to mind is wrongdoing or failure of someone else, where you've been let down or hurt or harmed by someone, or someone you care about has been hurt or harmed in some way, or you're just deeply disturbed and troubled by the terrible wrongs and injustice of our world, rather than letting that go round and round in your head, jot it down on the red piece of paper and hang on to those pieces of paper, because we're going to find something to do with them at the end of the service. So, as we look at the passage, if you've got Joshua 8, it'll be up on the screen, but it might be helpful to have it open on your phone or in your Bible in front of you. Let me remind you of where we're at in this story. Andrew was explaining to us last week, after the Israelites crossed the Jordan, so they're going from east to west, so imagine they're on the other side. No, that's the wrong way around. I'd need to be in Perth. Okay, let's just pretend they're on the other side of the Blue Mountains, even though that's the wrong way around. They need to head, after they've taken the city of Jericho, they have to head west through the rugged hill country that runs through the centre of Israel, because they're heading over to the fertile plains, the farmland that lies along the coast. And they've got to go find a way up these valleys and over the hills. And as Andrew explained last week, Ai was probably a military outpost, a small town built inside the ruins of an ancient, even more ancient hilltop fortress that was a place to defend one of the pathways through the hill country. It's not very big or impressive, but it's well positioned on top of a hill, which means it's a good lookout. It's hard to sneak up on and easy to defend. And the first time, but it's small and it's a bit of a ruin. So the first time they went up against Ai, the Israelites thought that it was going to be a total cakewalk. And what actually happened was they got their butts severely kicked. And Joshua was devastated by that. He and the elders of Israel expressed their shock and their grief in fairly dramatic fashion. And Joshua basically throws himself on the ground in front of the Ark of the Covenant and demands that God explain to himself. We thought we had a covenant with you. What's going on? And God basically tells Joshua, get up. This is not on me. This is on you. You have broken your covenant with me. So covenant's one of those words that you don't really hear outside of the Bible these days. And probably the closest idea that we have that we're familiar with is the idea of a treaty. An agreement that countries make with their allies. A treaty is something that defines the relationship and it outlines the responsibilities that allies have with each other. And if a country breaks a treaty, that's a pretty serious business. A broken treaty is not easily renewed or restored. And biblical scholars have noticed that the covenant that God made with the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai was very similar to a form of treaty that was really common in the ancient world. It's got a fancy name in history called a suzerain vassal treaty. And that just means it's a treaty between someone strong and someone weak. The strong suzerain state and the weak vassal state. And the way such treaties worked is that the stronger state protects the weaker state. And in return, the weaker state is going to be loyal to the stronger state and usually pay them some kind of tribute, money or people for their army or horses for their army or something like that. And when you bear that in mind, God's frustration with Joshua makes a lot more sense. Because God had a covenant with Israel. He would be their God and they would be his people. He would protect and provide for them. Actually extraordinarily generous terms of covenant. He was going to give them a land of their very own. And in return, it was their job to be loyal to him. But when they attacked Jericho, they weren't in fact loyal to him. God asked them to devote the city of Jericho to him. They weren't to plunder it and take the spoils for themselves. They were to leave it entirely to him, almost like an offering. But Achan had, in the terms of that covenant, stolen what was owed to God and lied about it. And that threatened the covenant itself. Israel had effectively broken the treaty, broken faith with God. Achan and his family paid for that disloyalty with their lives. But if you're standing at Joshua 8 verse 1 and you're about to go up against the city of Ai, the question on everybody's minds is our treaty with God intact? Does the covenant still stand? Because if it doesn't, if he's not with us and we go up against the city of Ai, we tried that already. We're going to get massacred again, literally. And it's against that background that chapter 8 opens with these words. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid or discouraged. Take all your fighting men and attack Ai, for I have given you the king of Ai, his people, his town, and his land." Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. Those words sound a little bit familiar to you? Well, they should, because it's almost exactly what God had said to Joshua on the eve of Israel crossing the Jordan just a few weeks earlier. Be strong and courageous, for you are the one who will lead these people to possess all the land that I swore to their ancestors I would give them. This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And when God uses these same words again in chapter 8, he's telling them, don't be afraid or discouraged by your failure to keep our treaty. I am still with you wherever you go. I am still committed to my covenant with you. As odd as it may seem, when you've just heard that story of death and destruction of judgment read, this chapter is in many ways a story of forgiveness. God has forgiven Israel for their unfaithfulness. He's reset the relationship and he's giving them a do-over with Ai. Why? Because God is faithful to his covenant. He is a God who keeps his promises. And if you remember all the way back to when the covenant or the treaty was first made at Mount Sinai, God wanted the people to know who he was. He'd already given Moses his true name, Yahweh, I am. And at Sinai, he explained what that name meant, what he stood for. We have recorded for us that the Lord came down in a cloud and he stood there and he called out his own name, Yahweh, in front of Moses. Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger. I am filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations and I forgive iniquity, rebellion and sin. Joshua 8 demonstrates God's unfailing love and faithfulness to Israel, his forgiveness even of their unfaithful rebellion against him. So God tells Joshua, I've given the king of Ai, his people, his town and his land to your hand. You will destroy them as you destroyed Jericho and its king. But this time you may keep the plunder and the livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush behind the town. And that's what they do. And then at a key point, the Lord says to Joshua, point the spear in your hand towards Ai, for I will hand the town over to you. Joshua did as he was commanded. As soon as Joshua gave this signal, the men in ambush jumped up from their position and poured into the town, and they quickly captured the city and set it on fire. Joshua did as the Lord commanded. The army of Israel did as the Lord commanded. That's emphasised in the text. If you look closely at the text, you'll see that the way the destruction of the city of Ai is described mirrors very much the way the punishment of Achan and his family is described. The fate of Ai was the same as the fate of Achan. And I think we're supposed to understand that God is using Israel to bring judgment on Ai for its wrongdoing, just as he used Israel to bring judgment on Achan for his wrongdoing. Achan and his whole family were killed. The entire population of Ai was killed. The bodies of Achan's family and their possessions were burned. The bodies of the people in the town was burned. At the end, the Israelites piled a huge heap of stones over Achan, and they piled a great heap of stones over the body of the king, over the head of the community was treated in the same way. Monuments help you remember what happened. They serve as a warning as well as a memorial. In this case, this is what happens to those who fall under God's judgment. And I think that's maybe part of why the story is included in the Bible. The Bible's like our memorial. In 1 Corinthians 10, we're told that the Old Testament stories were written down for the same reason, as examples and warnings for us. But how do those two things hold together? Forgiveness of sin for Israel, but judgment for Achan and Ai. Again, if you go back to when the covenant was first made and God explained to the children of Israel what his name meant and what he stood for, he didn't only say that he was a God of forgiveness. He also said, "But I do not excuse the guilty. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children and grandchildren. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and the fourth generation." That leaves us with quite a sense of discomfort, doesn't it? God forgives some people and he judges others. And his judgment of Ai was so very, very brutal. How do we make sense of that? If you want to take a deep dive into this, I highly recommend the book Confronting Old Testament Controversies by the very, very pretentiously named Tremper Longman III. Don't hold his name against him. He is a well-respected evangelical Bible scholar, and his book gives a really good summary of the main ways over the centuries, like historical biblical scholarship and theology, that people have tried to make sense of God's brutal judgment of Achan and Ai. And I'm not going to attempt to summarise all those options. But what I do want to do is share with you 3 ways of looking at this story that have helped me in my wrestling with this passage over the last few months. And that may be helpful to you as you try to grab hold of God in this. The first thing is to ask ourselves, what kind of account is this? The book of Joshua isn't a 21st century historical textbook whose purpose is to provide an objective, factual account of events. Not least because that way of writing history wasn't invented until after the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century. If you try and read it that way, you're reading a way that we do history back thousands of years, and you're trying to colonise the past. If you do it that way, you're going to misinterpret it. When biblical scholars looked at the book of Joshua alongside other ancient Near Eastern texts, they've realised that the whole way Joshua is put together is pretty similar to other ancient conquest accounts. Those accounts use vivid and often really overblown language to describe the victories of the kings that they're written in praise of. And the book of Joshua is written in that style to exalt God as a great king who conquers all of his enemies. It's telling us true things about God and how he acts in the world. God is a king. God is victorious over his enemies. We can absolutely rely on that truth. But we're not meant to take every statement literally, and there's very clear evidence in the text itself for that. If you skip down to next week's passage, and you look at verses 33 and 35, and you look at verses 33 and 25, although we're told in verse 25 that the entire population of Ai was wiped out, and a few chapters earlier that the entire population of Jericho was wiped out, we read this: "Then all the Israelites, foreigners and native-born alike, along with the elders and the officers and the judges, were divided into 2 groups. Then Joshua read to them all the blessings and the curses that Moses had written in the book of instruction. Every word of command that Moses had ever given was read to the entire assembly, including all the women and the children and all the foreigners that lived among them." If everyone in Jericho except Rahab's family and all the people of Ai had been killed, where did all these foreigners suddenly come from? When Joshua 8 records that the entire population of Ai is wiped out, I think what we're supposed to understand is that the fortress was taken and destroyed. Its population was gone. No one lived there anymore after that time. But I don't think we're supposed to take it literally to mean that every single man, woman and child was put to death. But that only helps us a bit, because nevertheless it is quite clear from the text that at least some of them were killed defending their home against the Israelite attack. And how are we to make sense of that? So a second way of looking at this passage is to consider the destruction of the town of Ai in the context of God's relationship with the people of that region over time. Now you might be thinking, what relationship? God is the God of the Israelites. What relationship does he have with the people of Canaan? God is the king of the whole world. He is the God of all. But if you look back in the scriptures, if you cast your minds back, Remember that when God first promised the land of Canaan to the Israelites, he didn't promise it to these Israelites, he promised it to their ancestor Abraham, the one he first made the covenant with. And at the time that he made that promise, at the time that he made that promise, Abraham was living in Canaan, in the area. In fact, he was living in the hill country, in the area that the Israelites are conquering now. And Genesis 15 describes God making that covenant with Abraham. He promises him that he will have many descendants and that they will inherit the land where he's currently living as a nomad. And in the middle of all this promise, God says this rather odd thing. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. They will be enslaved and mistreated there. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." The Amorites are one of the nations that live in this area. God says he's not going to drive the current inhabitants of the land out for another 400 years. They're already guilty of wrongdoing. God describes their behaviour as sin, as a violation of his standards. But they aren't yet deserving of the sentence that Joshua and the children of Israel will carry out in the future. How did God deal with the sin of the people living in the land that he wanted to give to Israel? Well, first of all, he sent Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to live among them as his children, as his witnesses. We also have a really odd story in Genesis about a guy called Melchizedek, a Canaanite king who acts as a priest towards Abraham, which suggests that at least some of the Canaanites knew and worshipped God. But over time, their worship shifted to the pagan gods and goddesses that they were still worshipping in the time of the book of Joshua. God gave the Canaanites 400 years of grace while the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. And then when the Israelites were wandering around in the desert and eventually crossing the Jordan, he gave them a further 40-odd years to get their heads around the way that God had revealed himself in Egypt and to take the opportunity to enter into a covenant with him by joining Israel. And we've already seen that some of the so-called foreigners did, notably Rahab and her family in chapter 6. And if you read ahead to chapter 9, the whole town of Gibeon made a peace treaty with Israel and joined them rather than be destroyed. Remember what Rahab told the spies back in chapter 2. "I know that the Lord has given you this land," she told them. "We're all afraid of you. Everyone in this land is living in terror. We have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt. We know what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 Amorite kings east of the Jordan, whose people were completely destroyed. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight you after hearing such things. For the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below." Rahab says the Canaanites realised that Yahweh wasn't a God, he was the God. But yet few of them responded to that revelation by trying to make a covenant with the God of the heavens above or the earth below, or with his people Israel. So in the end, God did use Israel to bring his judgment on them. What was it that the people had done that was so bad that it deserved such drastic judgment from God? And that's, I think, the third lens that we can use to try and understand these events. If you look back at Leviticus, at one of the books of the law that was given to the Israelites in the desert, God gives them some pretty strong warnings in chapters 18 to 20. And I've just got a few verses from it here. The Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. I am the Lord your God, so do not act like the peoples in Egypt where you've come from, or the people in Canaan where I'm taking you. You must not imitate their way of life. You must obey all of my regulations and be careful to obey my decrees, for I am the Lord your God. If you obey my decrees and my regulations, you will find life through them. You must keep all my decrees and regulations by putting them into practice, otherwise the land which I am bringing you to as your new home will vomit you out. Do not live according to the customs of the people I'm driving out before you. It's because they do these shameful things that I detest them. God tells Israel that he detests the shameful practices of the people who live in the land he's rescued them from, that's Egypt, and the land he's going to give them, that's Canaan. And Leviticus 18 to 20 describe in quite graphic detail some pretty appalling practices. The Canaanites worshipped fertility gods and goddesses. They believed that those gods and goddesses controlled various aspects of nature and that they depended on them for the fertility of their crops, their livestock, and even their families. The way you worship fertility gods is with what you might describe as fertility practices. And this included, according to Leviticus 18 to 20, consulting mediums or spiritists to commune with spirits, including the spirits of the dead, inappropriate sexual relationships and practices, including some fairly degrading and exploitative ones, and most horrifically of all, child sacrifice. God says the things that the Canaanites got up to were so revolting that even the land itself couldn't tolerate it and vomited them out. It's like even the land is revolted. And God warns the Israelites that engaging in any of these practices will violate his covenant with them and result in them sharing the Canaanites' faith. How do you feel about that? If you think about women and men trapped in degrading and exploitative sexual practices because of the so-called worship that the fertility cults demanded, or tiny humans burnt alive as sacrifices to the fertility gods, not one-offs, but persistently over decades and centuries. Do you feel differently about the destruction of AI? Personally, I found these words from a Croatian-American theologian. Skipped one. MIROSLAV VOLF, very helpful. He writes, I used to think that wrath was unworthy of God. Isn't God love? Shouldn't divine love be beyond wrath? God is love, and God loves every person and every creature. And that's exactly why God is wrathful against some of them. My last resistance to the idea of God's wrath was a casualty of the war in former Yugoslavia, the region which I came from. According to some estimates, 200,000 people were killed and over 3 million were displaced. My villages and my cities were destroyed. My people were shelled day in and day out, some of them brutalised beyond imagination. And I could not imagine God not being angry. Some of us remember that. If you don't remember it, it was pretty much the same as what's happening in the Ukraine now. How did God react to the carnage? By doting on the perpetrators in a grandparently fashion? By refusing to condemn the bloodbath, but instead affirming the perpetrators' basic goodness? Wasn't God fiercely angry with them? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because he is love. When you look at the realities of our world, whether that's the horrors of mass graves being uncovered in Ukraine and the brutality that those bodies testify to, or the sadly much more familiar destruction that addiction or domestic violence or unfaithfulness causes in the families we know, are you okay worshipping a God who doesn't take that seriously? God's forgiveness doesn't mean that he doesn't take sin seriously. He doesn't sweep it under the carpet, and he doesn't ask us to either. God is deeply grieved by the disturbing reality of wrongdoing and its terrible human consequences. He's more than grieved, he's furious. And this story reminds us of his promise that he will see justice done one day. One of my favourite authors, TISH, Warren Harrison, points us forward to John's vision in Revelation of the time when God will put everything right, when all evil and injustice and wrongdoing, ours and everyone else's, will finally be dealt with. And I think her meditation really helps me feel how God's love and God's justice are interconnected in anger and in grief. She says this: the end of the Bible turns to the end of time, and John describes a breathtaking moment when God will wipe every tear from his people's eyes. When we finally see God face to face, we will be made whole, and there'll be no more death or crying or pain. All things will be set right. But not until we have one long last cry. Redemption itself does not skip over the darkness, but demands that every last tear run. The image of God wiping away our tears could, of course, be a metaphor, a statement that all things will at last be well. But what if it's not just poetic language? What if in the face of our Maker we get one last chance to honour all the losses that this life has brought? What if we can stand before God one day and hear our life stories told for the first time accurately, in all their entirety, with all the twists and turns of meaning that we couldn't follow when we lived through them? What if the story includes all the darkness of suffering, all the wounds we've received and given to others, all the horror of death, and we get to weep one last time with God himself? What if before we begin to live in a world where all things are made new, we weep with the one who alone has the power to permanently wipe away our tears? The problem that we face with the story of the destruction of Ai, and one of the reasons that the story is so disturbing for us, is that we want God's forgiveness for us and his judgment for other people, don't we? We want a story of the good guys and the bad guys where we're the good guys. We want to know that we're the children of Israel in this story and not the people of Ai. But one of the most disturbing things about the book of Joshua is that God apparently doesn't look at things so neatly. Rahab, a Canaanite, gets written into the covenant, and Achan, an Israelite, gets erased from it. The book of Joshua asks us a very uncomfortable question. Are you God's ally? Really? Are you sure? Are you being faithful to the terms of the treaty with him? We are also a covenant people, a people who've made a peace treaty with God and pledged our loyalty to him. God hasn't changed over the centuries, though Jesus has revealed his nature to us more fully. But the terms of God's covenant with us are new. The night before Jesus went to the cross and he shared a final meal with his disciples, he told them, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." The writer to Hebrews describes God making that new covenant with us like this: "You've not come to a physical mountain, to a place of flaming fire, darkness, gloom, and whirlwind, as the Israelites did at Mount Sinai. But you have come to Jesus, to the one who mediates the new covenant between God and people, to his sprinkled blood, which speaks of forgiveness instead of crying out for vengeance, like the blood of Abel." So let's be thankful and please God by worshipping him with holy fear and awe, for our God is a devouring fire. Looking back to the covenant, the old covenant, and looking forward to the new, the writer of Hebrews warns us that we mustn't forget who God is and what he's like. God is like one of those incredible thunderstorms that are terrifying in their ferocity and power. If you're inside, safe and warm and dry, they're an awesome sight, aren't they? One that fills you with wonder. But if you're caught outside, they're terrifyingly dangerous. When we stand in right relationship with God, safe in the covenant he has made with us through Jesus' blood, then his exercise of powerful justice should fill us with awe and thankfulness, as it did for the people of Israel when Ai was destroyed. But that's not an easy or always a comfortable reality, is it? And I want to give you a moment to look down at the pieces of the paper in your hands. I don't know if you had time, if anything came to mind that you wrote down or you had time to reflect on them. The story of the destruction of Ai may have brought up for you grief and fear because of your awareness of your own wrongdoing. And if that's the case, let it also be a reminder to you that we worship a God of forgiveness. We can always return to God as Israel did, own our own disloyalty and recommit ourselves to the covenant, and he will forgive us and renew the covenant with us. There's no 3 strikes and you're out with God. He's faithful to his covenant with us to the very end. And if you wrote some things down on the white paper during this service, I had you write them on white paper because they're things that God has already forgiven in Jesus. You only have to receive that forgiveness. But that doesn't mean that God is skipping over the realities or the consequences of wrongdoing, over the tremendous damage that people do to each other. And if this story of the destruction of Ai brought up for you anger and distress over the wrongdoing done to you or to others, then let it remind you that God takes evil and injustice and wrongdoing very seriously, and he will judge it eventually. Maybe after months or years or decades or even centuries, but that wrongdoing will not stand. And if you wrote some things down on the red paper during this service, I had you write them down on red because it's hard to hide. Red paper, isn't it? They're things that God sees and that he will one day make right. And if you think God isn't acting to deal with the things that have hurt you the most or that trouble you most deeply in our world, be assured that God will put it right one day. And he's asking you to trust that he is who he has always been, the God of justice who does not leave the guilty unpunished, the God of love who is desperately angry with those who have hurt and harmed his precious children. The band's going to come up and lead us in a final song, but as they do, I want to invite you to do something with those pieces of paper and with the things that they represent. I've got a bowl here. You probably wondered what I was doing at it, but I'm going to put it up on top of the piano at the foot of the cross. And if it's meaningful for you, fold that piece of paper up and come and put it there. Put it in this bowl. Let that action symbolise your trust in the new covenant in Jesus' blood, your trust in him to make all the wrongdoing in the world, yours and that of others, right one day. One day it will be possible to wipe all the tears away one last time and to enter into the future God promises, where there's no more death or crying or pain. I'm not going to read what you've written, no one is. After the service, I'm going to burn them on your behalf. But I invite you to come and let's just take a moment pointing us forward to that last day to remember and to acknowledge the pain and the reality and to trust it to God.